Welcome to tonight's speaker forum. Glenview Community Church and Following in the Way of Jesus welcome and celebrates all of God's children. I'm going to introduce Tom Aldrich, who is co-chair of the Speakers Forum Committee with Peter Grant. Tom, you want to introduce our guest Ian and say a few other things?
Yes, thanks very much, Elizabeth. Welcome everybody and happy Cinco de Mayo. This is the 8th Speakers Forum for this church year and our final Speakers Forum as we conclude our schedule for this church year. And we've ranged from talking about combating global warming to preparing healthy meals during the coronavirus pandemic, and from addressing systemic racism to supporting resilience among ourselves and our kids during the pandemic crisis. We will be back next fall with another exciting year and informative lineup of programs that we are sure you'll find interesting, as well as educational and even funny, perhaps. I want to thank the people who have made our year a success in this difficult time. I want to thank our presenters as well as those volunteers who've contributed their time and talent to enhancing Speakers Forum. Particularly, I want to thank Pastor Elizabeth, not only for publicity, but for being our technician and handling all of the Zoom details and the live streaming details, and she's been great for that. Thank you. I also want to thank other publicity folks, CJ Schultz, Tanya McCarthy, who's helped a lot with posters and publicity, Susan Woodson, and Peter Grant. I want to thank our Fiat partners, Betsy Martin and Nancy Malarkey, our WISE partners, Lauren Bauerschmidt and Karen Aldrich, and our Faith Formation ministry partner, Tara Call. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening. Professor Ian Hurd is a professor of political science and director of the Weinberg College Center for International and Area Studies at Northwestern. He's going to speak about our northern neighbors, what Canadians think of America and Americans. And he's going to be talking, half an hour, 40 minutes. And then we'll open it up for Q&A afterwards. And hopefully there'll be some good questions and some live discussion then. It's a pleasure to introduce Ian. We go back a couple of years when he was our tour guide, our faculty representative, when Karen and I were with the Northwestern alumni tour to the Canadian Rockies. And he was a great inspiration to us, not only to talk about Northwestern, but to talk about his home country and the beauty of the Rockies. But I'm anxious to hear what he has to say tonight about what his fellow countrymen think about America and Americans. And so, Ian, welcome and take it away.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks especially to Tom and the committee for organizing, and Elizabeth for all her help, and to everybody. It would be a lot more fun, I'm sure, to do this in person, but I don't think that you guys would all fit into my guest bedroom, so this might be a better way to do it. As Tom said, I teach international law and politics at Northwestern, and I grew up in Canada. I came to the United States in the mid-1990s for graduate school. And so I've spent about half my life on each side of the border. And I thought what I might do tonight is just offer some thoughts on how things look from the Canadian side and try to give a sense of what it feels like to be in the Canadian-American relationship, as it were, but from the Canadian rather than the American perspective. And the spirit of this is really just to try to get a sense of how things look from somebody else's position, in somebody else's shoes. It's in order to see that the things that seem kind of taken for granted from one's comfortable position usually look different from somebody else's position. and that there's a lot to be had in the conversation across those different perspectives. I tell my students at Northwestern that one of the purposes of college is to start to see the complexity that's hidden in things that appear to be simple. And I think that's an intuition that can be useful for whatever discipline, whether you're thinking about physics or law or politics. And because the US and Canada are often indistinguishable in so many ways, it can be really fun to kind of get below the surface and see the work that's being done by some of the subtle differences that give such a characteristic to the relationship. And what I'd like to do, I guess, to set up here is to imagine that we're on the border between the US and Canada on the Canadian side, and to imagine yourself in Montreal or Winnipeg or Vancouver. I'll share the map here from my screen just to give a feeling, right? Imagine ourselves on the border and think about facing north. So if you turn and look north from those Canadian cities or anywhere in between, you're looking at the wilderness, essentially. If you turn and look south, you turn your back on the wilderness, you look south, you're looking at the United States. And I think I'm gonna play around with this idea a little bit and suggest that Canadians are caught physically and spiritually, if you like, between these two. They exist on a thin line between north and south, between the wild that is the north and the weirdness that is the south. And it really is a line. I guess I say line, we think about the border as a line. It's a line in another sense as well, in the meaning that just about everybody in Canada lives very close to that border. So the population density is very concentrated in the 100 miles along the border. In fact, 87% of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the Canadian border. Let's see what that looks like here. I have a population density map here. So here's the same map, but now with population, and you can see the red line there that denotes 100 miles. So just about the entire population lives snug up against the American border, where there's a very physical, real sense in which if you turn one way, you're facing the US, and you turn the other way, you're facing the black part of the map here, which is listed on the map as sparsely populated, but essentially has no concentrations of people, and so is a natural space for the most part. Of course, there are some people, but very sparsely populated. I was thinking of what this means in an American context if we were to translate that concentration of population to the American setting. If you go 100 miles south of the Canadian-American border into the US, you get to Hibbing, Minnesota, or Seattle if you're out west. So imagine if 290 million Americans were concentrated in that little strip between Hibbing, Minnesota and International Falls, between Seattle and the Canadian border, let's say north of Syracuse, New York. So that's the equivalent American situation to the Canadian. And it's one of the things that in Canada is simply taken for granted. It's the way it is, everybody understands it, and you feel it in a sense, but it's not what everybody talks about because it's so obviously just part of the reality. So I'm going to divide my time here a little bit in half and think first about looking south and then think about looking north. So if we're in our Canadian position and we look south and we're looking at the United States, what do we see? Well, you're looking at a country down south, the US, that has 10 times as many people as Canada does, and about 10 times the economy, and vastly greater cultural and global influence. And there's a pervasive sense in Canada in which one can feel quite small next to the United States, and especially next to its kind of cultural influence. It's a running joke in Canada that Canadians pay too much attention to the United States in everything they do. And Americans pay very little attention to Canada. So if the US, in fact, let's think of a practical matter here. If the US government sets rules for American issues, these often have spillover effects simply due to the weight of the enormous economy and polity that is the US in comparison. So if the US government, for instance, sets auto emission standards for cars in the US, or child car seat safety standards that are meant to apply to Americans, it's often easier for the Canadian government to simply adopt the same standards so that companies can make one product and sell on both sides of the border without having to go through the work of making a separate Canadian version. And that gives the US government a kind of informal influence in Canada that's often resented by Canadians, but also is often taken advantage of. It's kind of useful. You know, maybe in Canada, you can count on the US Food and Drug Administration to check the safety of your COVID vaccines so you don't have to do it yourself. And you can take advantage of the fact that the US government is doing a lot of this work. So that said, I guess there are some clear differences and some similarities in sort of broad demographic issues. As I said, the population difference is a ratio of about 1 Canadian to every 10 Americans. And there are some famous points that everybody always indicates in difference: fewer guns in Canada, universal health care in Canada, lower levels of inequality, lower personal income taxes, longer life expectancy, higher standards of living. This list is sounding a little biased. I guess I should have found some problems in the Canadian side, but you know, so there are some demographic differences that the statisticians can point to, but the cultural context is very similar between the two, and in fact, to the point where John Wing once said that Canadian is merely an unarmed American with health care. Let's think about the economic situation from the Canadian perspective in this relationship. Of Canadian exports, about 3/4 go to the United States. And about half of what Canada imports from the world comes from the United States. So this is a very dependent relationship, if you like, or a very heavily trafficked economic relationship. It's often said that the central problem of Canadian governments, the policy decisions that they're struggling with on all fronts, generally have to do with how to deal with this dependence on the US for both imports and exports. And in fact, it gets even more interesting because Canadian exports are almost entirely raw materials and automobiles. So about 3/4 of the Canadian exports to the US, which were 3/4 of total Canadian exports, about 3/4 of those exports to the US are cars, agriculture, or energy. It's a heavy influence of just those 3 sectors of the industry and of society: cars, agriculture, and energy, oil and natural gas. In fact, almost all natural gas in the US comes from Canada. That's 99% or so. And just about all natural gas that Canada produces goes to the United States, 99% again. So there's a very interesting kind of weighting of this relationship when it comes to trade. It's so heavily concentrated in manufactured autos and car parts, oil and energy, and agriculture. And it has a regional dimension as well that's worth thinking about. Let me bring back my Canadian map here. The manufacturing is almost entirely located in the little strip of land between Quebec City and Windsor, Ontario. that strip that I'm sure you're familiar with from travels that goes through Toronto. And most of it is between Montreal and Windsor, heavily around the Toronto area here. I'm not sure if my little dancing cursor is showing up for you, but that's what I'm trying to indicate. And in fact, half the Canadian population lives in that little stretch from the mouth of the St. Lawrence River here, where it opens up to the Atlantic, running down along the lakes to Windsor, Ontario, a heavy auto hub. So half the Canadian population lives there, more than half the manufacturing is there, almost all the auto industry is there. And then of course out west, the energy industry is heavily located, heavily biased towards northern Alberta, some in northern Saskatchewan, essentially from Edmonton north, before you get to the Northwest Territories. And the agricultural production is a little more spread around, but really the heavy industrial agriculture, of course, comes from the prairies, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and into Alberta. And the agricultural products that we're talking about are largely wheat and oil seeds, canola seeds like that, oil seeds, and wheat. For population, I was thinking, since this map is up here, I was thinking today about the density of population. I was thinking about the Northwest Territories, so this Arctic patch north of Alberta and Saskatchewan that reaches to the Arctic Ocean. It has a population of about 40,000 people, and it's more than twice the size of California. So when we talk about the North being sparsely populated, that's kind of the level of sparsitude that we're talking about. It's and just about everybody in the Northwest Territories lives in Yellowknife. It's a city of about 30,000, 35,000 people. So there are people there in these areas, but it's so sparsely populated that that one thinks of it as a space of nature, as I'll talk about in a minute, as opposed to a space of people. So that regional dynamic within Canada is quite strong and interesting, and it kind of colors a lot of what happens in Canada. Thinking there about energy out west, agriculture out west, and manufacturing in Ontario and the corridor up to Montreal and Quebec City. It means that in Canadian politics, the controversies are almost always somehow hooked into questions about how different regions are being treated by the government, by the federal government, or by economic conditions. When the price of oil falls, the Alberta government goes bankrupt every time without fail, because it gets so much of its revenue from the proceeds of selling energy at world market prices, which then obviously fluctuate. They don't really go for personal taxes and things like that in Alberta, because when energy prices are high, they don't need to, because they can suck up money from American companies buying their energy. But every international shock affects the regions differently. So when there are Canadian constitutional controversies, they're usually about regions, how the provinces are being treated. So thinking about Alberta, should the Canadian federal government get some share of the profits from Alberta's oil resources or not? Should other provinces share in the profits from the oil that happens to be in Alberta or not? How do you decide these questions? What are the formulas for sharing the wealth? Another classic question is whether the government of Quebec should be allowed to have its own rules on things like immigration to recognize its unique French language majority and its history, or should the federal government be setting nationwide immigration policies? How do you decide these things? How do you split the difference? These are perennial Canadian constitutional issues. Them and many more are based in the fact that this drawn out population along the Canadian border is also economically and socially divided in a regional sense. So all of this, I guess, in a way, is just to say that the size and the influence of the US to the south conditions much of what happens in Canadian politics and society. And it also creates a kind of contradictory impulse, both attractive and repulsive. The US is like both sides of a magnet at the same time. It's the main source of imports, the main destination for exports, the main place for Canadians to travel, the main source of tourists coming to the country. But it's also, I guess as a consequence, the main source of fear and anxiety as well. Always about this concern that somehow whatever is Canadian about Canada is in danger of being swamped or overtaken by whatever it is that's American about America. One of our, I lost my thing here, here we go. One of our prime ministers in the 70s, who you'll remember, Pierre Trudeau, summed it up this way, that living next to you, the United States, is like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly and even-tempered, one is affected by every twitch and grunt. So this twinned attraction and resistance is especially evident in the world of culture, of writers and actors and musicians and comedians, who in Canada often reach a point of choice that's quite explicit, where they just have to decide whether to move to the United States or not. Being seen as famous in Canada only can feel like a bit of a cop-out as compared to moving to LA, let's say, and trying to hit it big. But leaving can feel awkward as well. Now, the big drama occurs in the opposite direction when American cultural products arrive in Canada. Since, as I mentioned, that American cultural dominance is widely feared in Canada, and the government has a continual challenge of trying to figure out what, if anything, to do about it, and how and where to resist, assuming that you want to resist. There's an acute sense in Canada of what's Canadian and what's American in pop culture. And what's American is often seen as worth looking down on, even though it might be addictively entertaining. And actually, it sounds here like I'm talking about your presidents, but not all of them. But there's a sense in which Canadians are quite worried that the sheer force and volume of American cultural products will erase the cultural distance that they value across the border. This goes as far as the government directly regulating how much TV and radio time goes to Canadian versus American shows and music. TV stations that broadcast over the air have to show Canadian content for at least 50% of their primetime broadcast hours. And on the radio, 35% of songs need to be Canadian. This is both a cultural policy and also a jobs policy. It's a bit of an industrial subsidy for sure, since it subsidizes TV and radio industries for jobs and more production, because it creates a stable market, a really predictable level of demand. You know, every Canadian radio station needs to have decent Canadian music to play in that 35% of the time. And so it encourages producers to make content to fill that demand. And so TV stations need producers of Canadian shows. And so for that, they need sets and they need technicians and they need all the apparatus that makes television programming possible. So this cultural policy has had the not unintended effect of seeding a quite active Canadian radio and TV industry. It also leads to the really weird business of the government having to decide who's Canadian enough to count in these quotas. And there's an office whose job it is to decide if a song counts as Canadian or not. It's a funny thing because it seems sort of stupid. Are we still recording this? So it's a funny thing because it does seem like it's a bit trivial and a bit self-absorbed, maybe. But once we think about that policy of requiring stations to play this content, you can see how somebody's got to do that work, because the producer at the TV station, they may not care, but they need to know if this counts or not for my Canadian quota. And so they need somebody to decide. Right? Is Neil Young still Canadian? I don't know. Like, he's lived in the United States and California on that ranch for like 60 years now. But the radio producer needs to know if his songs are going to count towards their quota or not. And so they have all these formulas to figure out who gets to be Canadian and who doesn't, which I'd be happy to talk about more if you guys are interested. From the experience of the viewer, you may have had this experience in Canada. It's pretty easy to tell watching TV in Canada what's the Canadian content and what's the American import. The Canadian ones usually look kind of cheap and weak compared to the imported shows. In that way, Canadian content, or as it's called in Canada, CanCon, is usually understood as tasting worse, but being good for you when compared to the American. And the American always sort of starts to look like junk food in the sense that it's just way tastier, even though you're not supposed to be enjoying it as much as you are. Actually, this reminds me that the show Schitt's Creek, that won so many Emmys this year, started its life in Canada as one of these Canadian Broadcasting Corporation productions to fill the Canadian content slots. So it was subsidized by the main television network because they needed some Canadian content to be able to show. It just happened to be good enough or popular enough that it could be exported back to the United States. So all of these are the kinds of issues that I think of when we imagine standing in Canada, facing south. Now let's turn around and look north. I think the relationship to the space in that direction is even more interesting. I tried to give a little sense there in the Northwest Territories of how sparsely populated it is. The populated parts, the heavily populated parts of the country, I think live every moment knowing that when you look north, you're looking into a vast space of nature. Rocks, lakes, ice, tundra, space, climate, weather, animals. Geography gets real looking that way. And it's largely not a human space, but a natural one, which of course makes us think about what's the relationship between those two, but bear with me for a sec. It's a space where an individual person probably can't survive by themselves. They need help to survive. They need help from other people or help from machines and from buildings or good fortune from nature. I grew up in Ottawa. I'll bring the map back for this. I grew up in Ottawa, and down here, it's within the 100 miles of the American border. And from there, if you face north, you can look over a couple of small towns there on the Quebec side of this border. There's a few roads. It's a giant national park there. And then there's lakes and trees and wilderness and the Arctic. If you were to drive north from Ottawa, which I guess, you can't do because there aren't roads. But this is a mind game. So let's imagine if you head north from Ottawa, let's fly instead. That might be more efficient. If you fly north of Ottawa, you will not pass over a town of 40,000 people until you get all the way over the North Pole, down the Russian side, through Siberia, to the border where southern Russia meets Kazakhstan and Mongolia. There's a big sized city over there. But between Ottawa and that place, Novosibirsk in Russia, there's hardly anybody. In fact, there's a town of 40,000 people, Val d'Or, right about here. So it's not even on my line going north, but I included it just to be safe. So that's what you sense looking north, just as if you lived in Vancouver, in the suburbs of Vancouver, and you'll need, if you're on the mountain side of the city, you'll get bears in your backyard, and you have to have bear-proof trash cans and all the rest. So this sense of being at the edge of an inhospitable place, a place that's not meant for you as an individual human, is really important. The space isn't necessarily threatening, but I think everybody is alert to the idea that it's a space in which you have to be very aware of your surroundings and your location relative to the city. If you go just a little off the trail, you'll be alone in a very real sense. What you have is thousands of kilometers of wilderness, of forests and lakes. And what I'm trying to get at here is the closeness of that wilderness for people who live in the populated parts of the country. It's right there. It's the next thing after your suburb. And the closeness of the wilderness gives a really visceral sense of nature and its forces that produces a sense of scale and a kind of sense of vulnerability that I think is really hard to experience in the United States. So for Canadians, the North means forests, lakes, tundra, winter, few roads, bush hopping plains, danger, winter, animals. One fun exercise worthy of lockdown, I don't mean fun in the real world, but fun for lockdown fun, is to use Google Maps and see how far you can get going north. There simply aren't a lot of roads into the north. So most of the places that you see on the Canadian map that I showed you, you can't drive to. If you want to get to Hudson Bay from Ottawa, it's only 1,000 kilometers, which I guess isn't that far all considered, but you can't get there. There's simply no road. It's not a human space in that sense. I'll show you another quote here that a Canadian poet famously describes Canada this way: "Mon pays, ce n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver," meaning my country isn't really a country, it's the winter. I think that captures something that most Canadians would feel quite accustomed to feeling. That is, that I live in a space that is not made for people, it's made by natural forces, and I accommodate to those forces rather than the other way around. As I say, I think that's a little hard as an experience to get in the United States. I sensed it a little bit in the deserts of the Southwest. And obviously you can go to kind of wilderness-ish sorts of places in the US, in the mountains and in all kinds of places. But I think what's different here is there's a scale difference where the populated parts of Canada abut right up against the serious wilderness in a way that doesn't often happen in the United States. The closest might be some of the desert areas in the Southwest. But in Canada, that's the normal condition, the kind of taken for granted sense of your existence in this physical place. Now, at the same time, I would say that most Canadians don't go north. I've never been. And I think that's typical. Most don't ever spend any time there. They've never seen it. They've never experienced it. But they know that where they live, in Winnipeg, Edmonton, Calgary, whatever, Montreal, that they live at the very edge of the city, of the habited part, and across the line, which is often a line you can see from any tall building in your city. You could go up to the 12th floor of the tall buildings of Winnipeg, and you can see the edge of the human space. Across that line is the beginning of a forest or the prairie. And that's where the world goes immediately into its natural state. And it's a place where you're really, as an individual, no match for the forces that work there. So it takes some careful thought if you're going to travel and survive there. This brings me to a very convenient device that I found quite powerful from Margaret Atwood, novelist and cultural writer, who said long ago that at the heart of Canadian literature is the idea of survival. And she compared this to American literature, in which, as she sees it anyway, the key motif is the frontier. The Western frontier, the expanding frontier, space as a frontier. And she said in Britain, the key idea is the island. And she diagnosed these as the archetypal themes in each country's distinctive cultural conversation. And for Canada, she sees survival as the key motif. Survival in the wilderness, looking north, where you need the help of others to survive. Right? The early Europeans needed the First Nations in order to survive, and later they needed each other. And more contemporary literature looks south and thinks about survival in relation to the United States, playing on the perpetual fear that the US will swamp Canada culturally, if not politically or by invasion. And also, remember, think of the French-Canadian position of looking to survive, in Margaret Atwood's terms, amid Anglo-Canadian dominance, and then continent-wide Anglo-American dominance. I mean, English-speaking American dominance, So I find Atwood's perspective to be a pretty useful heuristic when in doubt, if you have any moment where you're trying to understand a Canadian impulse. She's thinking about a communal need to stick together to survive, looking both north and south, north to the winter and the wilderness and the nature, and south to American expansionism. And you might stretch this to say that this gives Canadians a sense of vulnerability and humility in the face of forces that are way stronger than you, and you've got to figure out some way to accommodate yourself to in the spirit of survival. Now, getting to the end here, I realized I only just now got around to mentioning Quebec and the First Nations in Canada, both of which are huge and interesting topics. Let me say on the Quebec front, the basic lay of the land there is that within Canada, 30% of the population is French speaking. I'm sorry, that's not right. 30% of the Canadian population lives in Quebec, and 3/4 of them are French speaking. So let me start that again. So in Quebec, the prevailing language of families and business is French. About 3/4 of people speak French as their first language within Quebec. About 7% of people in Quebec speak English as their first language. So what does that leave? 15, 17%, 13% who speak something else, neither French nor English as their first language. That 77% French speaking within Quebec is an anomaly across the country. It's the only province, the only region that has that heavy majority of French speakers. And that's of course been true since the earliest days of Europeans building stuff in what's now Canada. So we have 250 years or so of this being the case. And the question of survival from the point of view of French Quebec then, of course, is founded on the history of the continuation of French language and culture in an English language majority place. And French Canadian nationalists often imagine that they're a French island in a North American sea of English speaking culture, and that they must survive against both the forces of nature from the North and also this English majority that's all around them. And that produces a kind of an interesting political dynamic within the province. It can produce a kind of authoritarian politics, a kind of defensiveness that looks to prevent English from taking over. There are many, as I'm sure you know, regulations on where English language can be spoken and taught in Quebec. And some of that can be a little harsh on the English speakers, but the motivation by the French nationalists who are in government is to find ways to prevent English language from spreading and overwhelming the French. But you can imagine how this looks on a national scale then, where the Quebec government is looking to do things like prevent kids from going to English language schools in Quebec, because it looks to the rest of the country like they're getting in the way of the choices that individuals or families might want to make. And if you're thinking of moving from an English part of the country to Quebec, you have to weigh in the fact that likely you won't be able to send your kids to an English language school. And that can feel like you're being blocked by the special rules of one region, which in a way, in an American sense, you would probably file under a problem of interstate commerce. In Canada, we think in more flavorful terms, and I'll wrap up here by quoting Stuart Keat, who describes Canada as the Vichyssoise of nations, cold, half French, and difficult to stir. So my personal experience, just to put this in a little bit of context, is that I'm a kid of the 1970s, and I grew up in Ottawa, which is the national capital. And in that era and that place, I was, I guess, indoctrinated with a very particular kind of Canadian political identity that's probably evident in what I've said so far. That time and that place were kind of the peak moment for a multiculturalism in Canadian style, where the federal government based in Ottawa was working very hard to promote a bilingual national identity, where everyone was encouraged to learn both English and French, at school, at work, on TV. We had a version of Sesame Street in Canada that was half English, half French, subsidized by the Canadian government. So the government actively, this is the government of Pierre Trudeau, in fact, actively sought to promote a national identity, a national culture that was built out of this duality. So instead of saying that, well, part of the country is French here in Quebec and the rest is English, and we've got this separation that creates two different things, the idea was to say that Canada had a dual identity in which both were true. So instead of separating peoples and regions, the idea was that this was a composite identity, and that to be Canadian meant celebrating the presence of both English and French. And that duality is what made Canadians Canadians, they said. And Ottawa is a government town, much like Washington, DC, or even more like Canberra, Australia. right? It's almost all employees of the federal government who work there. That's the reason for being there. And so when the government decided that it would advance this multicultural policy, it effectively meant that if you were to get a job in Ottawa, you had to be bilingual. And so the city became a bilingual place. You couldn't get a job there without speaking both English and French. And it didn't matter which you started with. So there was no anti-French bias. There was no anti-English bias. It didn't matter where you began. The requirement was that you be able to function at work in both languages. And so the schools worked hard to produce bilingual kids. And all of this was central to at least my upbringing and people of my generation in that place. The government has backed off a little now, but that shaping, that attempt to construct a national identity out of a French-English dualism certainly shaped me forever, and remains, I think, true in Ottawa, at least, as the physical epicenter. All of this just to say that if the story would probably look different if it were told by somebody from Edmonton or Iqaluit or Shawinigan, but that's my experience. As I said, I left in 1994, so if you want to know what happened since then, you have to check Wikipedia. But other than that, I'll be happy to continue the conversation or answer any questions. Hey, Tom, I see a hand. Is that how this should work?
Yeah, well, I'll call on folks and monitor the chat. You can either put something in the chat or raise your hand on the, if your screen is off, there's a way to do it through the participant buttons. Tom?
I've got several questions, but I'll be brief and ask just one, at least to start. I have a sense that there are lots of issues among Canadians that you really haven't had the time to explore tonight, but could you comment, Ian, on the First Nations people, who of course we Americans refer to them as early Americans or whatever, but I like First Nations, and what's happening with the energy lobby in Canada, because I know there's a real push-pull there, which has some effects on the US, for example, in whether or not pipelines get built and what the Trump administration or the Biden administration do about pipelines that are supposed to come from Canada to the US.
Yeah, that's great. A huge topic for sure. The starting point might be to remember that as a percent of the population, the First Nations comprise a much larger population in Canada than they do in the United States. I believe it's over 5% of the Canadian population in total is First Nations. And these people are obviously not evenly distributed across the territory. So in many of the communities on the prairies, the population is much, much higher, 30%, 50%, even in some of the big cities. So, and the history of relations between the sort of the federal government and First Nations is arguably less violent than in the United States, in the sense that there are kind of fewer massacres and less sort of whole-scale genocide, I guess, but still quite spicy, in the sense that the well, I guess so. Let's get real. So the many of the First Nations in Canada have never ceded their territory to the federal government and never sort of subordinated their sovereignty to the federal government. And so in a legal sense, they maintain kind of equal sovereign legal status to the federal government. So they are not subordinates to the state. They are kind of, in an international legal sense, equals, which isn't to say that they have, equal capacity to do stuff, and they've certainly been marginalized as heavily as the government could manage, including often whole-scale taking away of generations of kids and raising them elsewhere to try to stop them from associating with First Nations culture and language and history. But that independence is quite important when it comes to, as you say, pipelines and energy and transit rights. So I mentioned the energy sector in Canada, the fossil fuel sector being dominated in northern Alberta. The vast majority of that product needs to get piped out of there. This is the tar sands oil that is, and natural gas that's being kind of blasted out of the ground, pumped out of the ground. So that travels by either by rail or by pipeline. And to get to the transit hubs, either on the west coast of Canada around Vancouver or in the US, Houston and in the East Coast, they have to travel over First Nations territory. And that, since there's no sort of legal subordination of the First Nations to the federal government, that entails essentially the company negotiating with a sovereign state along the way. And that becomes, well, as a business matter, a tricky negotiation. It can be quite expensive, since essentially these territories have veto rights over what gets done on their land. And if they simply tell you not to build your pipeline here, you're going to have to find another place for it to run. And through the mountains, that's probably not an easy thing. But it's a continual legal and business and kind of broader social dynamic that clashes together not only the energy exporters and the big businesses, which are mostly foreign owned, not Canadian, that want to do the extraction against the First Nations populations, but also within the First Nations community themselves, there are differences of opinion, of course, and some are quite happy to accept a payoff in order to allow a pipeline to go through if that's going to be reinvested in the community. Some are opposed on environmental or other grounds. So the dynamics become really interestingly complicated, both within the First Nations communities and at the interface between First Nations and business. Now, that was a 4.5-minute answer to a question that is fantastic, because we could spend all year talking about it, because it's got so many interesting twists and turns. I'd be happy to think about other aspects too as we go along here.
There's a question in the chat, and then Betsy. So the question in the chat is, how serious was the Western provinces movement to leave Canada and join US in the 1970s? What was the driver of this movement? I just learned something new, so I can't wait to hear the answer.
Well, the driver was when OPEC instituted its oil embargo against the United States, or at least the Gulf states did, and the price of oil shot up. Suddenly, Western Canada, at least the oil possessing parts, became hugely wealthy, because the oil in the ground was worth far more, 10 times more than it had been a week before. And that wealth became a source of controversy, because the question came up of who controls it and how should it be used. The federal government in the 1970s believed that some of that wealth should be shared across the country. So it should be absorbed into the federal government's coffers, so that it could then be used to subsidize government activities across the country. But to the government of Alberta, that looked like theft or something. And so there was some friction there between the Western provinces with their oil wealth and the federal government that was trying to institute what became known as a national energy policy to share the wealth across the country. It never became a serious separatist movement out west. So the first part of your question, I would say the answer is that was never very serious. The motivation was Alberta wanted to essentially keep the oil wealth that it suddenly, by accident, found itself sitting upon. Of course, the more persistent and serious separatist movement is in Quebec, which since about the same time has been developing through various ways the possibility of separating from Canada and either becoming its own independent country of Quebec or having some kind of anomalous relationship in which it is not really Canadian, but not really an independent country. And there are lots of models, of course, around the world for those sorts of independent regions. The Quebec separatist thing comes and goes as a popular fight. The province is currently being governed by a kind of strange hodgepodge of French Canadian nationalists and kind of fiscal conservatives. These two never liked each other much in the past. So it used to be that you could either be fiscally conservative or you could be a French nationalist in Quebec politics. But they found a way to get along long enough to be in power now for what, 5 years or so, 7 years. And I think they might be building up towards having a referendum in Quebec on a kind of sovereignty association model, which wouldn't be complete separation, but might give the provincial government more autonomy. But there's another fantastically interesting and complex social and historical pattern, which I'd be happy to talk more about too, if people want to go down that path. There's too many paths.
Yeah, Betsy?
So I've been taking courses from Northwestern professors about climate change, and the fact of, as the global warming goes, all of that wilderness would be subject to migration from the heating up the peoples from the south, and also becoming a place where agriculture would be important for the world. So what do you know of Canadian thinking or thought about how they deal with that?
That's a great question. So it's evident already, for sure. One can travel in the Rockies and see the glaciers retreating much faster than they were, faster than they ever have, in fact. And thinking about energy production, actually the people who work up in northern Alberta getting the oil out of the ground used to be able to count on the ground being frozen most of the year. So they could drive your trucks across the tundra to get from one place to another. But now that melts. And so instead of being a solid layer, it's become swampy and marshy, and you can't drive on it anymore, which means you have to build more roads in order to get to where you're going in order to extract the oil. So even as the nature around them is warming and becoming a swampy mush from carbon emissions, they're still working ever harder to get the oil out of the ground to essentially make more carbon emissions. The Canadian federal government takes global warming very seriously and has launched a number of quite adventurous measures to become less of a carbon emitting state and to encourage move away from fossil fuels. But given the statistics I cited at the beginning here, the one thing they think they cannot do is slow down the production of fossil fuels for export to the United States. So even while the federal government is investing hugely in alternative energies, it's still working hard to build pipelines for natural gas and for petroleum products that cross both the natural landscape and human areas and go across the border. So they're a bit of a mess if you want to think about consistency. The federal government, they're serious about the problems of climate change. They totally understand it. They buy it. They get what's coming if we don't fix our ways. But they are so dependent, or they think they are so dependent on American purchases of fossil fuels from the Canadian West and North, that they they can't stop themselves from fighting for more pipelines. So you'll notice that in struggles like over the Keystone Pipeline in the US, the Canadian government is no ally of the people who want to slow down pipeline construction. The Canadian government, as well as the Alberta government, are involved in the lawsuits in the US to force the US government to give permits to build these pipelines. So I know some of the people in the Canadian government, and they're fine environmentalists, all of them, and yet they feel so bound to the fossil fuel industry for revenue that they can't imagine accepting limits on that. So that contradiction is a strange one. I imagine that looking back 100 years from now, it will be easy to see that this was a kind of a short-sighted contradiction. But the people living in it don't see a way out of it from the policymakers' point of view. And on migration, I guess my sense of the territory that we're talking about that's warming in the Canadian North is that it's not particularly habitable. I mean, the tundra is turning to mush in northern Alberta. I guess you can drain it and build condominiums there, but that's a lot of work. And in the forests of Quebec and Ontario, British Columbia, the trees may die off, but what you'll be left with is a lot of rock and a lot of lakes. So I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of capacity there for human in-migration.
So there's a question in the chat. Let me see. It's what role, if any, does the crown play in Canadian culture? Meaning, how much do Canadians care about the Queen?
That's a great topic, yeah. And I assume you mean the Queen and not The Crown, the TV show. Although I guess they would go together. Yeah, so as a legal matter, the Queen of England is also the Queen of Canada. And she must approve all legislation that comes out of the Canadian government, just as she approves all legislation that comes out of the British Parliament. So she is formally the head of state and officially kind of the last word on all political and legal matters. But in practice, that does not translate into any actual power and authority. It's a rubber stamp, and it's impossible to imagine a circumstance in which the Queen might veto a piece of legislation that Parliament had approved. The only thing that she has much influence over is the choosing of the next government, in the sense that she appoints the Prime Minister for the federal government. And the rule is that she has to do it out of the majority party in Parliament. So whichever party has the most seats in Parliament, they tell the Queen who among them is going to be Prime Minister, and she approves it and appoints that person Prime Minister. But there's a little bit of margin there where if it's not clear who has a majority in Parliament, there might be a little bit of discretion as to who she interprets as being the person who ought to be Prime Minister. A little bit like the Israeli situation at the moment, of kind of collapsing coalition governments and the president there repeatedly pointing to Netanyahu or others as having the opportunity to form the next government if they can. Something similar could happen in Canada, where the Queen could have a little bit of autonomy there in if there's essentially a tie in Parliament as to choosing the Prime Minister. But that's the kind of formal legal stuff. But the more fun stuff is the cultural side, where I guess one answer is I don't know how much Canadians care about the Queen, in the sense that that's, you'd have to ask each and every one. But I think that there's not very much movement to overthrow her and install a republic. it's just not a very popular position, I think, because most people don't see much of a problem with the current arrangement. There's nothing so dire or problematic about the current situation that it's causing people to mobilize to change it by eliminating the Queen from the position. Now, if the government were to, let's say, offer a referendum, an open vote for Canadians as to whether to abolish the monarchy or not, I don't know what would happen. My guess is that it'd be about split. I would not be surprised if it went up or down. But there's not much interest in doing that, asking the question, because I think at the moment there's no sense that there's a problem that needs to be fixed. And I guess just like Americans looking over to London, Canadians like the soap opera quality of it. And it's pretty entertaining in its own way to follow the vicissitudes of this family, especially when so little seems to be at stake for your national politics. Now, I should say, of course, that Meghan Markle is a graduate of Northwestern. And in fact, she majored in the program that I'm the director of. So I feel like I almost know her. And when she first fled England, she and Harry, if you recall, when they sort of organized their removal from the scene in London, they moved to Canada. At least she did, with I guess there was one kid at the time, and moved into an estate just down the road from where my parents live on Vancouver Island. I think it was a much larger property than the one that my parents live in, and had, I think, more fencing and guard dogs, but still, she was in the neighborhood. And my mother reported that her bridge playing friends occasionally spotted her in the local sandwich shop, picking up her lunch.
I think Karen and then John. You have to unmute Karen.
There's another hand too that.
Okay, I didn't see the other one.
That's okay.
Okay.
So my question is, Ian, we've had this conversation in the past about the politics in Canada. And as some of the politics over the last administration have changed from the views that used to be not the same always, but connected to Canada, and were agreed with the two politics from the Canadians and the Americans, were kind of on the same path, and they agreed to the direction that the countries were going. And as we did kind of a 180 on a lot of issues here in the United States, what has Canada done to redirect or stay the course of how they want to visually have their politics be considered in the world? And we had talked how the Canadians were trying to stay the course and not necessarily go in the same direction that the US had gone in. Is that the case now, or you are making having alliances with other countries other than the United States because of the United States had changed their policies, I guess is what I'm trying to say. What's happening with that?
Yeah, I think the Canadian government's view of the Trump years was essentially that country's lost its mind, and we can't leave the continent, so we have to sort of figure out a way to deal with them, but we don't want to, we don't want to share in their craziness. So at that time, you're right, that one of the strategies of the government was to go find other like-minded countries that it could deal with around the world, and see how much could be done while leaving the US behind while it was in that state of having lost its mind. So having Biden win the election is, to the Canadian government, kind of a return to what seems like normal. And so those years, I think the current Trudeau government is happy to block off as a strange aberration in history, the Trump years. And now they can deal again with the people in the White House in the way that they're used to, which is sort of, you know, on more sensible grounds. That said, I guess there were some reverberations that will last a while. It was, from the Canadian point of view, so shockingly easy for the Trump administration to really mess with the trade relationship between the US and Canada. And I don't think that many Canadian policymakers had anticipated how easy that would be. Things like steel tariffs and interfering in the auto industry. I think the Canadians imagined that those relationships were so clearly beneficial for both sides and so profitable and well established that they would be hard to break. But what Trump showed was that one guy who has a particular view is able to mess with those longstanding institutional relations and add tariffs to things that make no sense under WTO law, but to make them stick. Trump made them stick. Congress more or less caved, and the White House didn't care about the World Trade Organization. So I think the Canadian government was shocked and worried, is still worried, at how easy it was to overthrow things that the Canadians thought were just settled and beyond question. This is especially in this trade relationship. And I think that still has them a little bit concerned, because even if Trump is gone and that weirdness is not a daily reality in the relation between the two countries, they realize now that other things could come, and they might want to try even harder to diversify the source of national wealth, because their eyes have been opened to how vulnerable they could be, even in such a short time, and really to just this one individual who happened to come in second in the national election in the United States. So the guy who came in second in the presidential election managed to mess up the US-Canadian trade relationship. So that put the Canadian government really on notice that you can't take this stuff for granted. That's not to say that they have any idea what to do next. As with the oil industry, these things are so deeply embedded in the industries of the country that it's not easy to change. But that lasts. But for the rest of it, I think they see the Trump years as a bit of a nightmare that they've woken up from, and now they can go back to more normal affairs.
Thank you. All right, the Marmots, both of you had your hands up, so I don't know. Okay, all right, go ahead and ask your question, Golly.
Hi, just a question about Vancouver. You didn't mention Vancouver, its population density, and what effect Vancouver, and because that is so different from the rest of Canada, has on the overall influence of Ottawa. And I'm from Buffalo, and I'm used to just popping across the border all the time. So this is strange for me, what is going on now.
Yeah, oh, I can imagine, right. In growing up in Ottawa, we used to get the local American broadcast TV networks from Rochester. So the only things that I learned about America were from watching the Rochester local news in the evenings. So I knew a lot about, you know, traffic accidents and new malls opening and crime and stuff of Rochester. Yeah, it is very strange to not have that cross-border possibility these days, and we hear it on both sides of the border that it's really harming business, but also people's family lives. Now, you ask about Vancouver, and that's a really great place to locate ourselves for a little while. Since you say that it's quite different from the rest of the country, which is certainly true, although also you might say that every place is different from the other places. From the point of view of national politics, Ottawa is very far from Vancouver, as you said. And so the sense of being part of this federal structure looks really different from way over there, dangling off the left-hand side of the continent. And as you hinted at, I think much of what makes Vancouver feel different than other parts of the country is that it quite literally is facing Asia. and it's looking at Asia, and a lot of what goes on in Vancouver and that part of British Columbia is thinking about China and India and the rest of Asia, and not thinking necessarily in the same way that, let's say, Montreal might about the United States to the south. Vancouver has grown a lot in the last, let's say, 30 years or so, and has become a kind of booming, and as you it sounds like you know, very kind of West Coasty city in its culture and its politics and its multiculturalism. And it has its own mini economy that is neither manufacturing nor energy extraction. So its economic profile is quite different from the rest of the country. There's a fair amount of logging money that travels through Vancouver. But really it's a place of cultural production, movie production, tourism, and breaks a little bit of the mold of the old Canadian story of being the supplier of raw materials to the United States. And for that reason, it's all the more fascinating as a Canadian location. Have you spent some time there?
All right, thank you, Jane. All right, are there any other questions? All right, Tom. You got to unmute.
Sorry, that was my job.
Thank you, dear. Just to change the subject slightly, Ian, can you tell us something about the Weinberg College Center for International and Area Studies and what you do?
Sure. So this is a new center at Northwestern that I helped establish a couple of years ago, and I'm now the director of, that aims to be a hub on campus for research and teaching and student activities that have an international focus. So we house a number of majors in area studies, Middle East and North African studies, East Asia, international studies, in the sense, and housed by that I mean, if students want to major in these topics, they can come to our center and we'll help them find a curriculum that brings together the resources from around the university of courses here and there, and a bit of history and a bit of politics and language. And we'll help them build a major that gets them to the kind of studies that they're interested in that region. But we also have a series of research centers that the faculty are invested in that have to do with pursuing topics that don't fit into the old school departments like history or economics or religious studies, but rather cross between those and have as much to do with one as the other. So we have one group that's interested in law and markets. So it's a bit legal studies, it's a bit economics, it's a lot of history, some sociology. We give a place there where faculty at Northwestern can come with these ideas that don't fit into any one department, and we can help them build a research profile with a team of faculty and some resources so that Northwestern can be at the leading edge of these new topics, essentially topics that don't fit into the old, let's say, 19th century model of what a university department was supposed to be like. And the last thing that I do there is that I have a Friday afternoon talk show where I get, each week I interview a Northwestern scholar or person about the kind of work they do and why they think it's fun and interesting. And it's just a fantastic hour-long conversation where I can hear what other people are doing that's so interesting. And so
Is
that's
that on WNUR?
No, it's a podcast.
Oh,
okay.
Right. Because, it's not 1973 anymore, Tom. But no, it's
look at it.
so yeah, so we send that out into the world, and it's an interesting thing. I mean, it's my attempt to kind of remind all of us that the university is full of people doing all kinds of super awesome and interesting things that I know nothing about. And there's not a whole lot of ways for people to hear about what's going on in the other buildings on campus. And it doesn't take much to get an academic to tell you what they're doing, right? In fact, we sometimes have students on and the same thing works for them. I mean, if you say to somebody, what is it that got you into this topic? That opens up the whole world, right? And they could be a Nobel Prize winning physicist, or they could be an undergraduate writing a senior thesis. But if you pose that question at them, then they will start unpacking their whole life and how I got into this and how it was so interesting. And I tried this other thing and didn't really like it, or the experiments didn't work. You get this giant story. And so I really love these conversations. So that's the kind of thing that we're using the center to enable. It's a very little idea, but I think a quite sensible one. And without the center, it's not obvious that anybody at the university has the job of doing that sort of thing.
Nice.
So we're trying to make sure that these good ideas get picked up and carry them on.
Nice.
Are you involved at all with the campus in the Middle East?
I haven't been out there, and so I haven't taught there, but I know a lot of the people there, and we sometimes have events together. And in fact, these days, since we can't go anywhere, Qatar actually feels sort of closer than it did before, since our interactions are like this now through the screen. And in a way, it's made it, seem more of a connection, whereas before the distance felt great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? All right, I've enjoyed tonight immensely. I'm a historian first before a lot of other things, so it was fun. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. And Tom, do you have anything to say about next year's speaker forum? It's going to be exciting.
It's going to be exciting.
It's going to be exciting. And stay tuned to see whether we get to be in person or we're going to
be on WNUR.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
that's enough. All
And
right.
as a last word, I think I may need to apologize for the 1973 thing.
That's okay.
We could edit that out, right, Elizabeth?
No.
Oh, sorry, Tom.
I don't know. I don't know if you saw John make like whatever that was being recorded. So just so you all know. All right. You all have a great night. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you. It was a pleasure.